All right, guys, we're going to start with our next lesson. So this is Unit 10, Lesson 4. Now we're going to move to adding and subtracting polynomials. So our very first problem, the directions say find the sum or the difference. So sum is to add, difference to subtract. We have to put it in standard form. So in our last lesson that we just did, standard form means in order from greatest to least exponent. And identify the type and the degree of the polynomial, meaning tell me what his first name and last name is, which was from the last lesson as well. Okay, so if you'll notice, number 1 on the example, there are no letters in it. So I'm just going to kind of give you a basic middle school version of adding and subtracting polynomials. So adding, since there's a plus sign in the middle, you're basically going to add the like terms. So in this case, for instance, the 200 would be like the 100. And the 30 would be like the 10. And the 4 would be like the 5. So that's the whole basis around adding polynomials. You add who is like. Okay, so this is how we're going to do this. So this first parentheses, there's nothing in front of this first parentheses. There is an invisible 1, but if you multiply everything by 1, it doesn't change. So everything in the first parentheses is going to stay exactly how it looks. Okay? In front of this second parentheses, again, I don't see anything there, but I do realize that it's a positive 1. Multiplying everything by positive 1 would not change a thing. So everything in the first or second parentheses also stays the same. All right, now we're going to go through and we're going to add all those terms that were like. So the 200 was like the 100. So 200 plus 100 makes 300. The 30 and the 10 were like. So 30 plus 10 gets me 40. And then the 4 and the 5 were like, which gets me 9. And of course, since all these are digits, they do not have variables in them like you are fixing to see. You can just add all those together and your final answer is 349. So that's how the middle school way of teaching it is now, to do the hundredths, the tenths, the singles. Okay, all right, so put it in standard form. So your final answer is just a single digit, so that's already in standard form. And now I need to identify the type and his degree. So remember, his first name comes from his degree. So this guy does not have any exponents. Degree means what is his highest exponent. So we know his first name is constant. So if you needed to get your notes out from the lesson 3 that we just did, that's where that came from. And then his last name comes from how many terms he has. So he only has one single term, so he is a monomial. So constant monomial. Okay, so number 2 is now what your polynomials are going to look like. So as you can see, we've now got digits and we have letters with exponents in these. So again, the directions were find the sum or the difference. So we're finding the sum because of the plus sign. So we're going to go through what's in front of this parentheses is an invisible 1. If I multiply everything by 1, nothing changes. So everything in this first parentheses stays exactly the same. Okay, second parentheses, again, there's an invisible positive 1. So if I multiply everything by positive 1, nothing changes. So keep my positive x squared plus x plus 5. Now we're going to go through and we're going to add the things that are like. Now keeping in mind, I do want my answer to be in standard form. So I'm obviously going to start with the guys who have the biggest exponent. So x squared here and x squared here. So 2x squared plus a invisible 1x squared makes 3x squared. Okay, then we'll move to the exponent that's next to the 2, which would be this 1. Remember, there's an invisible 1 here that we don't see. So 3x and x makes 4x. And then we have just the constant, which means I do not have a variable. So 4 and 5 makes 9. And I cannot add that any farther. So we now have our final answer, but we need to name it. First name, last name. So first name comes from his highest exponent. Highest exponent, of course, since it's in standard form, is the guy in the front. So a 2 means my first name is quadratic. And then my last name comes from how many terms I have. I have 1, 2, 3 terms. So my last name is a trinomial. Okay. All right, so number 3, again, we are still adding. You see your plus sign in the middle, so still adding. All right, so first parentheses, there is an invisible 1 in front of this first parentheses, which means if I multiply by 1, nothing changes. So everything in this first parentheses stays exactly the same. Okay. All right, second parentheses, I have an invisible 1 here as well. If I multiply by a positive 1, nothing changes. So I keep my positive 4x squared, negative 9x. All right, so now we're going to go through and we're going to combine the guys who are like, and if I want it in standard form, I have to start with the biggest exponent. So my highest exponent is a 2, so x squared. So I have negative 7x squared plus, because it's positive, 4x squared. So a negative 7 plus 4 gets me a negative 3x squared. Okay, move to the next digit next to it. So we have an x. It went from x squared to a plain x to the first. So I have a negative 2x and a negative 9x. So if I combine negative 2 minus 9, negative 2 minus 9 gets me a negative 11x. And then lastly, I kind of have a loner here. I have a 3, but I have no other constants. Remember, a constant does not have a variable. So he's the only guy left, so you just tack him on to the end. He doesn't have anybody else to add to. All right, so we've got our final answer. Make sure it's in standard form, greatest exponent to least, and then, of course, constant in the back. And now we're going to give him his name. So my highest exponent was a 2, so that is quadratic. And number of terms is his last name. So I have 1, 2, 3 terms. So if I have 3 terms, I am a trinomial. Okay. All right, number 4. Okay, so there's something different about number 4. I now have a minus sign. So I'm now finding the difference between 2 polynomials. Okay, so we're going to start off the same way we just did. There is an understood positive 1 in front of this parentheses. So if I multiply by a positive 1, nothing changes. So I get x cubed plus 8x squared. That does not change. Okay? All right, so now what's now different is I've got a minus sign in front of this parentheses. Okay, that's an understood negative 1. If you multiply by a negative 1, do things change? So we're going to come to the side and kind of figure that out. If I do 6 times 1, the answer is 6, so it didn't change. But if I do 6 times negative 1, I get negative 6. So, yeah, it changed. So if you have a negative 1 in front of your parentheses, this changes. If I do negative 1 times 3x cubed, that gets me negative 3x cubed. So notice the difference in the first 3 that we did in this one. Now that I have a negative in the front, meaning I'm subtracting, it changes everything in the second parentheses. So now we just do it like normal. Starting with your highest exponent. So my highest exponent on this one is a cubed, so a 3. I have 2 of those. So if I've got a x cubed or a 1x cubed minus 3x cubed, that gets me negative 2x cubed. So 1 minus 3. Then, after the cubed, you have a square. And if you'll notice, he's kind of lonely. There's no other items for me to add him to. So he just tacks on here to the bottom. Okay, so that is your final. So now let's give him his name. So my highest exponent gets me the very first name. So my highest exponent is a 3. My first name is cubic. And then how many terms is his last name? So 1, 2. There are 2 terms. So that is a binomial. Okay. All right, last one. If you'll notice, there's still a minus sign on this one. Okay, so we're finding the difference. So let's start with our first parentheses. So first parentheses, I have an understood 1 in the front. If I multiply every single one of these by 1, nothing changes at all. So that means I keep every single thing in that first parentheses. Okay. Second parentheses. This time I have a negative 1. Okay, so here we go. If I multiply this guy right here by negative 1, so think about it, negative 1 times negative 6, it's going to change to a positive 6. Okay, if I multiply this guy by negative 1, negative 1 times negative 3 is positive 3. And then if I multiply this guy by negative 1 times negative 8 is positive 8. All right, so notice how on the first 3 that we did, a addition sign is just an understood positive 1, so nothing changed. But on the last 2, there's a negative sign. You're subtracting, so a negative 1 changed everybody in the second parenthesis. So basically, you're just changing his sign. If he's negative, he goes to a positive. If he's positive, he goes to a negative. All right, so now let's add our like terms. So starting with our biggest exponent because we want it in standard form. So we have negative 6x to the 5th and positive 8x to the 5th. That will give me 2x to the 5th. Okay, next up is our exponent of 4. So I have a negative 8x to the 4th and a 6x to the 4th. So that gets me negative 2x to the 4th. Negative 8 plus 6. All right, next exponent close to that would be just a simple x, and there are no other just plain x's to add with him, so I just tack him to the end. And then lastly, I have a 3, and there's no other constants to add him to, so I just tack him to the end as well. All right, so now let's give him his name. Highest exponent is a 5. So when my highest exponent is a 5, my first name is Quintic. Remember, I remembered him by, if you have 5 babies, those are quintuplets or quints. So this is Quintic. And then his last name comes from how many terms he has. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And we know if you have anything over 3, your last name is polynomial. So his name is Quintic Polynomial. Okay, so that is it for lesson 4. Adding and subtracting polynomials. So now there will be an assignment that goes with lesson 4 for you to complete. And that will be all for our first week of distance learning. So let me know how it goes. If you need help, please let me know. According to Mr. Elliott, math is only done on Mondays. So you only have math classes on Mondays. So you will see my next assignment and lesson posted next Monday, and we will go a little bit farther into polynomials and dive into multiplying polynomials. So please let me know if y'all need any help.